Your hands are shaking, and it isn't from the cold. You're standing in a workshop that smells like scorched metal, holding a blade that shouldn't exist. It bends like a green branch. It snaps back straight, and when you drag it across a hanging silk thread, the thread falls apart in two clean pieces before it even hits the ground. You make this sword. Nobody alive today knows exactly how it was made, and the man who forged it has been dead for 600 years. That blade is real. It's called Damascus steel, and it's just one entry in a long, uncomfortable list of things ancient humans built that we still can't fully copy. Not because we're less intelligent, not because we lack tools, but because somewhere along the way, the knowledge itself died with the people who carried it. Think about that for a second. We put machines on Mars. We've mapped the human genome. We've got supercomputers in our pockets that would look like sorcery to a person living 200 years ago. And yet there are techniques from the ancient world that modern engineers, chemists, and metallurgists have spent decades trying to reverse engineer and failed. Why does that bother us so much? Maybe because we like to believe progress only moves in one direction. Forward, upward, better. But history doesn't work like a straight line. It works more like a fire that burns bright in one place and then goes out and the smoke just drifts away, taking the secret with it. So today we're going to walk through some of the most powerful lost technologies in human history. Not myths, not ancient aliens. Real, documented, physically verified inventions that work so well they terrified the people who saw them and then vanished so completely that we're still trying to explain them. And by the end, you're going to ask yourself a question that's a lot more unsettling than how did they do that? You're going to ask, what are we losing right now without even noticing? Let's start in the water, because the first lost technology on this list didn't just win battles. It ended them before they began. You're on the deck of a wooden warship in the eastern Mediterranean. Sometime in the 7th century, the air smells like salt and tar. Somewhere behind you, a crew member is loading a strange bronze siphon, like an oversized water pump bolted to the ship's bow. Nobody tells you what's inside it. That's the point. Even the men operating the weapon don't fully understand the formula that makes it work. Only a handful of people in the entire empire do. An enemy fleet appears on the horizon. Drums start. Your commander gives one order. And then the siphon fires. Not water, but fire. Liquid fire. Shooting across open sea. Sticking to wood. Sticking to skin, and somehow, impossibly, continuing to burn even after it hits the water. This is Greek fire. And if you think modern flamethrowers are frightening, understand this. Greek fire could not be extinguished with water. Some accounts say water made it burn worse. Enemy sailors who jumped overboard to escape the flames sometimes found the fire, following them onto the surface of the sea. For centuries, Greek fire made the Byzantine Empire nearly untouchable at sea. It single-handedly repelled massive sieges of Constantinople, saving the empire from collapse more than once. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. The exact formula was such a closely guarded state secret that when the empire eventually fell, the knowledge of how to make it fell with it. Historians, chemists, and military engineers have spent over 1,000 years trying to reconstruct the recipe. We have guesses. Naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, pine resin, different combinations that could produce something similar. But none of them perfectly replicate the ancient accounts. None of them burn on water, quite the way the old texts describe. Ask yourself, how does a civilization lose a formula for its single most important weapon? The answer says something deeply human. The Byzantines protected the secret so intensely, restricting it to a tiny circle of trusted specialists, that when war, plague, and political collapse wiped out that circle, there was no backup, no written manual anyone could find, no apprentice trained well enough to rebuild it from memory. That's hook number one, and it should already be messing with how you think about progress. We assume knowledge is safe once it exists, but knowledge isn't a fact sitting in a vault. It's a living thing that has to be passed, hand to hand, mind to mind, or it simply stops existing. Now here's where it gets stranger. Because Greek fire wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's go back further. Way further. You're standing on a rocky slope in central Italy, watching workers pour a strange gray mixture into wooden molds along a harbor wall. It's roughly 2,000 years ago. The mixture includes volcanic ash, lime, and seawater, an odd, almost reckless choice, since seawater is supposed to weaken construction materials, not strengthen them. But here's what scientists actually found when they studied ancient Roman harbors that have survived fully intact after 2,000 years of constant ocean battering. The concrete didn't just resist the salt water. It got stronger over time. Structures that modern marine concrete would crumble under within a few decades are still standing after 2 millennia of waves, storms, and chemical erosion. Modern concrete, by comparison, often starts cracking within 50 years, especially in marine environments. We build harbor structures today that need constant, expensive maintenance and eventual replacement. The Romans built structures that seem to heal themselves. Researchers eventually figured out part of the secret. When Roman engineers mixed volcanic ash with lime and seawater, a rare mineral called aluminous tobamorite formed inside the concrete over time. Salt water interacting with the mixture actually triggered new mineral growth inside tiny cracks, sealing them shut before they could spread. In other words, the ocean wasn't attacking the Roman concrete. The ocean was, in a strange way, repairing it. We've now identified the general chemistry. But replicating the exact process at scale, with the exact volcanic ash composition, the exact mixing method, the precise proportions of Romans intuited through generations of trial and error, is still something modern engineers are actively trying to nail down. This isn't ancient mystery for the sake of mystery. This is a real material science problem that could change how we build cities today, if we can fully recover it. And this connects to something deeply human, something you probably felt yourself. We tend to assume older automatically means worse, flimsier, less capable. But ancient builders weren't guessing. They were running real-world experiments across hundreds of years, watching what survived and what didn't, and passing down only what worked. That's not primitive thinking. That's rigorous, patient generational engineering, the kind of long-term testing no modern lab could realistically replicate in a single human lifetime. Which brings us to the reframe, the one that should genuinely shift how you see everything else in this list. We like to imagine ancient people as struggling just to survive, cold, hungry, primitive, waiting for modern science to save them. But some of what they built wasn't achieved despite their limitations. It was achieved because of a completely different relationship with time. They weren't optimizing for speed. They were optimizing for permanence. And permanence, it turns out, is a kind of intelligence we've mostly forgotten how to value. Now, let's talk about something even stranger than concrete or fire. Something buried in a wooden box that was almost thrown away as scrap. You're a sponge diver off the coast of a small Greek island more than a century ago. You just pulled up wreckage from a shipwreck that sank over 2,000 years ago. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect: pottery, coins, statues eaten by the sea. But there's one corroded lump of bronze that doesn't look like anything else. Gears. Dozens of tiny, precisely cut bronze gears, fused together by centuries underwater. For decades, nobody understood what they were looking at. It sat in a museum, mostly ignored, labeled as some kind of astronomical curiosity. But here's what scientists actually found once they finally x-rayed it properly, more than 100 years after it was discovered. This wasn't a toy. It was a mechanical computer. The Antikythera mechanism, as it's now called, could track the positions of the sun and moon, predict eclipses years in advance, and even account for the elliptical orbit of the moon, a level of astronomical precision that Europe wouldn't match again for over 1,000 years. It has over 30 interlocking bronze gears, some with teeth smaller than a grain of rice, cut with an accuracy that modern engineers initially assumed was impossible for the ancient world to achieve by hand. Think about the implications of that for a second. This device predates what most people think of as clockwork by well over a millennium, and it wasn't a one-off miracle. Ancient texts reference other similar devices, meaning this level of mechanical sophistication may have been more common than we think. We've simply lost almost every other example of time, war, and neglect. So why does something this advanced just disappear? Why didn't it spark an immediate mechanical revolution? The uncomfortable answer is that knowledge doesn't spread just because it's brilliant. It spreads because there's a system in place to preserve, teach, and share it. The Antikythera mechanism likely required a small, elite group of specialists to build and understand it. When that specific line of expertise ended through war, migration, or simply a lack of successors, the knowledge went with it. This should sound familiar to you. Actually, modern companies lose institutional knowledge the same way. Constantly. An employee retires, and with them goes 20 years of undocumented expertise nobody thought to write down. A specialist dies, and a critical skill disappears from an entire organization overnight. We assume that because we live in the age of digital archives, this can happen to us. But knowledge has always been more fragile than the people holding it realize. Here's your second connection to modern psychology, and it's an uncomfortable one. We overestimate how permanent our own knowledge is, the same way ancient specialists probably did. They assumed their skills would simply continue, passed down naturally, the way skills always had been. They had no reason to believe an entire mechanical tradition could vanish. And yet it did. Now, we're at the midpoint of the story, and this is where things take a darker turn. Because what you're about to hear next was, for a long time, deliberately excluded from mainstream history books. Not because it was faked, but because it complicated a narrative that historians prefer to tell. You're standing at high altitude, then cold air burning your lungs, somewhere in the Andes Mountains centuries before European contact. In front of you is a wall built from massive stone blocks, some weighing well over 100 tons, fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. No mortar, no modern machinery, just stone, cut and placed with a tolerance that modern stonemasons struggle to match even with diamond-tipped power tools. This is Sacsayhuaman near Cusco, built by Inca engineers. And here's what scientists actually found when they studied the construction more closely. The blocks aren't just fitted tightly. Many have complex, irregular, almost puzzle piece shapes, each stone cut to match its specific neighbors rather than simple flat rectangular blocks. That means every single stone was individually shaped for one exact position in the wall. No two are interchangeable. Why go through that level of effort? Because that irregular, interlocking design is remarkably earthquake-resistant. The Andes sit on one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. Spanish colonial buildings constructed nearby, using European mortar-based techniques, have repeatedly cracked and collapsed during earthquakes over the centuries. The original Inca stonework, in many cases, has barely moved. That's not an accident. That's advanced structural engineering, developed through direct experience with violent, shaking landscape, encoded into stone rather than written texts. And it worked so well that it outlasted the empire that built it and outlasted the empire that conquered that empire too. For a long time, some Western historians downplayed or dismissed the sophistication of Incan engineering, partly because it didn't fit a narrative where advanced technology only flowed one direction, from Europe outward. It's only in recent decades that's serious. Structural analysis has confirmed what should have been obvious all along. This wasn't luck. This was applied science, refined over generations, by people who understood their environment on a level that outside observers simply fail to recognize. Here's your third connection to modern psychology, and it might be the sharpest one. We tend to associate technological sophistication with the aesthetics we already recognize. Wires, screens, gears, machines that look like our machines. When intelligence shows up in an unfamiliar form, wrapped in stone instead of circuitry, we're slower to call it what it is. That bias has cost us. It's likely caused entire bodies of ancient knowledge to be ignored, unstudied, and lost simply because it didn't look the way we expected genius to look. Should that make you a little uneasy? It should, because it means the line between primitive and advanced was never really about capability. It was about how closely something resembled what we already understood. Now let's head north into open, freezing ocean for something that sounds almost too strange to be true, until you realize sailors were using it to navigate without ever seeing the sun. You're on a longship somewhere in the North Atlantic, and the sky has been a solid gray wall of cloud for 3 straight days. No sun, no stars, no compass. Those wouldn't be common in Europe for centuries. And yet the navigator beside you lifts a strange, pale crystal to the sky, rotates it slowly, and calmly adjusts your ship's heading, as if the clouds weren't even there. Old Norse sagas describe something called a sunstone, used to locate the sun's position even through thick overcast skies or fog. For a long time, this was treated as folklore a myth mixed into stories about gods and heroes. But here's what scientists actually found when they tested the theory using calcite crystals, a mineral abundant in Iceland and Scandinavia. Calcite has a property called birefringence. It splits light in a way that reveals the direction of sunlight's polarization, even when the sun itself is completely hidden behind clouds. Researchers demonstrated that a navigator using a calcite sunstone correctly, rotating it and watching how the light behaves, could determine the sun's position with startling accuracy, even under overcast Arctic skies. That means Viking sailors may have had a functional, physics-based navigation tool over 1,000 years before humans understood the underlying science of polarized light. They didn't know what polarization was. They didn't need to. They simply knew that if you did the specific thing with a specific stone in the specific way, it worked every time in conditions that should have made navigation impossible. That's the part that should really sit with you. Deep scientific principles don't require deep scientific vocabulary to be discovered and used. Ancient people were running real experiments constantly, refining techniques through trial, error, and survival pressure, arriving at genuinely sophisticated solutions without ever framing them in a language modern science would later invent. We lost the widespread use of the sunstone the same way we lost so much else on this list. Not because it stopped working, but because newer tools eventually replaced it, and the specific, hands-on knowledge of how to read a calcite crystal properly simply wasn't preserved once magnetic compasses became common. Convenience replaced expertise, and expertise quietly disappeared. Does that sound familiar? It should. Think about how many skills you personally have let go of simply because a device now does it for you. Navigation, memory, mental math, even basic direction finding. We're not so different from the sailors who traded a subtle, physics-based skill for a simpler tool, except our version of that trade is happening constantly in almost every part of modern life, and we barely notice it happening. Now we're approaching the final quarter of this story, and this is where things get genuinely disturbing, because the next lost technology isn't about tools, weapons, or navigation. It's about something that happened to the human body, deliberately, and with a level of medical understanding that shouldn't have existed yet. You're lying flat on a cold surface, fully conscious, while someone presses a sharpened stone tool against your skull. There's no anesthesia in the way we understand it. There may be pressure, pain, the vibration of the tool scraping bone. And yet, across dig sites on nearly every inhabited continent, archaeologists have found ancient skulls with precisely cut holes, a procedure called trepanation, where the surrounding bone shows clear signs of healing. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Healed bone means the patient survived the operation, not once in some rare miracle case, but repeatedly across thousands of documented ancient skulls worldwide, with survival rates in some regions estimated as high as 50 to 80%. Think about what that actually requires. It requires understanding of anatomy precise enough to avoid immediately fatal damage. It requires some method of controlling infection, since untreated wounds from unsterilized tools should have killed most patients within days. It requires pain management sophisticated enough that patients didn't simply die from shock during the procedure itself. But here's what scientists actually found that makes this even stranger. Some ancient Japan skulls show evidence of multiple separate surgeries performed on the same person at different points in their life, all healed. That means these weren't desperate, one-time emergency procedures. This was a repeated, deliberate medical practice, refined enough that the same individual could survive it more than once. We still don't fully understand every technique ancient surgeons use to manage pain, prevent infection, and keep patients alive through skull surgery performed with stone tools. Some theories point to plant-based analgesics, ritual preparation that may have induced altered mental states, and specialized practitioners who pass extremely specific anatomical knowledge down through direct apprenticeship, rather than written record. And once again, that's the exact failure point. Direct apprenticeship. Knowledge passed only through hands-on teaching, from one skilled person to their chosen successor, with no written backup. It's an incredibly efficient way to transmit deep practical skill. It's also an incredibly fragile system, because it only takes one broken link, one war, one plague, one generation that fails to find a worthy student, for centuries of refined medical knowledge to vanish completely. Here's the darkest reveal, the one we've been building toward. It isn't really about ancient surgery at all. It's about what all of these lost technologies have in common, and what that pattern says about the world we're living in right now. Every single example in this story, Greek fire, self-healing concrete, the Antikythera mechanism, Incan stonework, Viking sunstones, ancient neurosurgery, was lost for the exact same reason. Not because the knowledge was flawed, not because it stopped working. It was lost because it depended entirely on a small, specific chain of human beings continuing to teach, practice, and protect it. And every single one of those chains eventually broke. That should terrify you a little, because we like to believe our modern world is different. We have the internet. We have libraries, archives, backups, cloud storage, entire institutions dedicated to preserving information forever. Surely nothing important could just disappear now, right? But think about how much of what actually keeps civilization running depends on deeply specialized, often undocumented human expertise. The engineers who understand aging infrastructure nobody has updated the manuals for. The specialists who maintain critical systems using knowledge that exists mostly in their own experience, not written anywhere fully. The generational skills, in farming, in craft, in medicine, in trade, they're already disappearing in real time as fewer people learn them, because it's easier to outsource, automate, or simply forget. We assume knowledge is safe because it exists somewhere, but existing and being preserved are two completely different things. The Byzantines had Greek fire written about extensively. They just never wrote down the actual formula, because the people who use it never imagined a future where no one would be left who knew it by heart. That's the real lesson buried underneath every lost technology on this list. Advanced knowledge doesn't disappear because civilizations get dumber. It disappears because the humans holding it die, migrate, get conquered, or simply fail to pass it on in time. And it turns out that it's always been true, in every era, including this one. So here's the question worth sitting with, long after this video ends. Somewhere right now, in your own community, in your own family, someone knows how to do something extraordinary that almost no one else knows how to do. A skill, a craft, a piece of hard-won practical wisdom that took them a lifetime to earn. And there's a real chance that when they're gone, it goes with them. The exact same way Greek fire did. The exact same way the Sunstone did. The exact same way ancient surgical knowledge nearly did. Ancient humans weren't less advanced than us. In many specific, provable ways, they were remarkably capable. Capable enough that we're still trying to catch up to techniques they mastered thousands of years ago. What they lacked wasn't intelligence. It was a reliable way to make sure their intelligence outlived them. And if you think about it honestly, that's not an ancient problem at all. That's a human problem, one we still haven't solved.